Senator Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you sat out the last debate. I just want to ask you, in the aftermath of that, you sort of did your own thing. How do you feel about that decision in retrospect?
Well, we'd rather that the media make the correct decision, which is that we should be included. We think, in fact, if you look at the polls, that they made a bad decision, and we're fighting and clawing to make sure that this time they will make the right decision.
Now, you're one of the unique voices in the race on the GOP side for a number of reasons. One of them is criminal justice reform. Right now, there's an effort underway in the Congress to try to put forward some mens rea, criminal state of mind protection into law. There's some bureaucratic pushback against that. Is that something that you would support if you were the President of the United States? You would support mens rea protection so you wouldn't have people going to prison for taking a lobster that's the wrong size by accident or doing things that...
Yeah, I have supported the mens rea movement, and basically it means that you have to say that there was an evil intention or a bad thought that went into committing a crime, that a paperwork violation is not a criminal activity, particularly since we have thousands and thousands of regulatory crimes now. No one can even know them. And with the lobster, the guys that were put in jail for the lobster off of Florida, wasn't even a U.S. regulation they broke. It was a Honduran regulation. So it has gotten way out of hand. And in fact, I wrote a whole book on it, Government Bullies, about how we've gone crazy with regulatory crime. So something has to be done. I've been a leading proponent of that, and I will push for it.
Now, one of the areas that you're generally going to be considered sort of outside of where the rest of the candidates are is on foreign policy, right? Coming from a libertarian perspective, I know there's some people that will throw out terms like isolationism, which I know you reject, but that's something that is often tacked on to anybody with a sort of libertarian philosophy when it comes to foreign policy. Where are you on foreign policy vis-a-vis the rest of the candidates and dealing with challenges like the Islamic State and Iran?
I think the facts on the ground in the Middle East actually argue for what I'm arguing, that when we've toppled secular regimes, when we've toppled secular dictators, we've gotten chaos and the rise of radical Islam. So I would argue that ISIS is worse because of us trying to push back Assad or topple Assad. I think the McCain, Graham, Rubio notion of bombing both sides of the war in Syria is idiotic. It's ridiculous, and it will lead to more instability and allow ISIS to grow stronger. I opposed sending arms in to the Islamic rebels that were fighting Assad, not because I have any love lost for Assad, but because I felt like if you push back Assad, you allow a space for ISIS to grow. And in fact, I warned explicitly 2, maybe 3 years ago, that one day the irony is you'll be back fighting against your own weapons. Sure enough, ISIS has $1 billion worth of U.S. Humvees. They have $1 billion U.S. dollars. They actually literally can pay their soldiers with money they took from us. They have tanks. They have anti-tank weapons. So I think the question or the idea of whether or not regime change is a good idea or a bad idea is a very potent one. And I think we win the argument on the facts. In Libya, Gaddafi, toppling Gaddafi, I think it led to chaos.
Going forward, though, now, I mean, you're telling me the lessons that have been learned from other administrations.
No, they haven't been learned. That's the problem. They haven't been learned.
The lessons you've learned, but how would you apply those lessons in a Rand Paul administration?
You apply those lessons by looking at Syria right now, and for those who want to bomb both sides of the war, that's a big mistake. For those who want to set a precondition that Assad has to go, for those who want to militarily push back Assad, I think those are all mistakes. But this is a compilation of mistakes over decade after decade. I think toppling Saddam Hussein led to chaos, led to the rise of Iran. Iran became emboldened. Look at it. We liberated Iraq. We spent $1 trillion. 5,000 young men and women died in that war, American young men and women. And yet Iraq immediately turned to Iran as their greatest ally and Russia as their second best friend. So really, it's hard to point to the Middle East and say intervention has helped America. I think intervention has actually made us weaker.
So you'd like a less active or less activist American, less interventionist American foreign policy in the Middle East. That's a fair statement to say about where your administration would go.
I think there's no reason why we should intervene on the side of people who are radical Islamists. There are people in Washington literally saying, well, for now, we have to temporarily side with al-Qaeda against ISIS. That is a foolish notion. Those people should be laughed out of polite society, and we should make sure once and for all, we are not a country that has to support radical Islam against another form of radical Islam. If we do, we're making a big mistake.
So you're not concerned about a vacuum that would be filled by other powers like Russia, China, and an Iranian hegemon that feels like it's growing because
there
of the
already
deal.
is a vacuum, and we created it by toppling Assad, by toppling Hussein. If we were to topple Assad, I think you have another vacuum. So it is a legitimate debate to still have whether or not it should be our goal to topple Assad. And most of the Republicans have said that. But many of the Republicans are very naive about foreign policy over there. You have Fiorina says she's not going to talk to Putin. Kasich said he's going to punch Putin in the nose or punch Russia in the nose. And Christie says,
bad idea.
Yeah. And then Christie says, oh, and I want to shoot down Russian planes as soon as I get a chance.
It's a really bad idea.
Yeah. So the thing is Russia's had a base in Syria for 50 years. Russia has troops and planes over there. They were invited by Syria, and they've actually been invited by Iraq to do flyover. And there's also cooperation with Iran. So for us to go and say, oh, we're going to have a no-fly zone where they fly, it's a recipe for war. And the people saying, we're going to punch Russia in the nose and we're going to shoot down their planes, these are people who aren't qualified to be commander-in-chief. And this is exactly what I'm saying here at this political forum in New Hampshire is we need to think who we want to have our commander-in-chief. So I think it's a great strength of mine that I do have a different position.
I wanted to turn us to domestic politics for a moment. There's obviously a lot of frustration from Republicans, conservatives across the board with the continued growth of government. Continues to get bigger, debt continues to get bigger. President Obama is going to leave us with about $20 trillion or so in debt by the time he leaves office. What are the main 2 or 3 things you can promise that you would do that would actually cut government if Senator Rand Paul is elected president of the United States?
The main thing to understand is it happens under Republicans and Democrats. Under George W. Bush, the debt went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. Under Obama, it's going to go from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. Obama will add more debt than all the previous presidents combined, but he didn't do it alone. The loudest voices in Washington for increasing spending right now are Republican. They want to increase military spending, but they can't get it unless they increase welfare spending. So the secret story of Washington, the unholy alliance is right and left both want to increase spending. They both get together, and the compromise that happens every time, Paul Ryan and Patty Murray got together to increase the budget caps on both, to increase the debt ceiling, and they've done it twice now. They did it in 2013, they've done it again. Paul Ryan and Patty Murray have increased spending $150 billion probably in the last 2 or 3 years because they both get what they want. The right gets military spending, the left gets welfare spending. The problem is, I think we become weaker as a country as we go further and further into debt. We borrow $1 million a minute, and from my perspective, the biggest threat to our national security is our debt.
Now, on the issue of metadata collection, I spoke to one of your opponents in the race, Marco Rubio, this morning, and he said that he's in favor of it, that he thinks that this is necessary to protect us from national security threats, most notably terrorism, but also cyber threats from abroad. What's your take on where that discussion, where that debate is going right now? Do you think that the American people have finally woken up to it in a way that there will be the change that is necessary there? Or do you think that people have sort of put this back burner and the metadata is going to continue?
I think that there will always be big government Republicans like Rubio who believe in trading your liberty for a false sense of security. But we've had the mass collection of all of our phone records for over a decade. There's no proof that it stopped one terrorist attack. It's been investigated by 2 bipartisan commissions who said no terrorists were thwarted by this. It also has been taken to court, and even under the Patriot Act, which has a much more liberal standard that I don't agree with, even under the Patriot Act, the court said it was illegal because they were collecting evidence in advance of an investigation. They couldn't say it was relevant to anything because they were collecting this evidence with no investigation ongoing. So I think it's wrong. I think it's a mistake to trade our privacy. And I think you can catch terrorists with a more focused approach. So like the brothers, the Sinarif brothers that were the Boston bombers, I would have collected all their records. If I were a judge, I would have given you permission to look at their records, their phone records, who they called, as many steps into the haystack as you need to go. But if you ask me, can you collect everybody in Boston's records, I'm a no. Because the idea that we are opposed to generalized warrants is enshrined in the Fourth Amendment. It was a big deal to the Founding Fathers.
Yes,
in fact, many people think it was really why we fought the Revolution was because we didn't want soldiers writing their warrants, we didn't want general warrants, and we didn't want them coming into our house.
If you want people to be terrified of big government and data collection, probably the best place to look would be the IRS. That's obviously getting a lot of treatment in this race from various candidates. You've got Ted Cruz saying he would abolish the IRS. People are saying, is that even really feasible? Is that possible? Talk to me a little about what you would do vis-a-vis the IRS and other huge regulatory agencies, this sort of federal leviathan growing out of D.C.
I think the problem Ted has a little bit on the issue is an authenticity one, because when he talked about collecting records, he's been for NSA reform, But then on the other hand, he responds to Rubio and says, oh, no, I voted for the reform because I want to collect 100% of cell phone records. And so for a lot of us who like privacy, we're a little bit worried about Ted saying, well, he was for the reform, but he's also for collecting 100% of cell phone records. So I'm not so sure where he would wind up on the spectrum of defending privacy. With regard to the IRS, my tax plan would get rid of the IRS, we'd get rid of the tax code, and we'd have one single rate. I'd have a 14.5% tax rate for businesses and for individuals, but there'd be very little need for any kind of intrusive IRS.
So you could say maybe a one-page tax code.
One-page tax code, and
code.
it'd definitely be a postcard that you'd fill out your tax return on.
So simplified to the maximum. That's one point I wanted to make sure we're clear on. I also wanted to ask you about how you feel about immigration. What's your stance on this? This is something that's been separating the candidates. Over the recent debates, you've seen a lot of back and forth over who's the strongest on immigration, who's going to lock down the border the most, who's going to give the fewest visas, who might even ban people from a certain country based upon their religious persuasion, or from all countries based upon their religious persuasion.
Right.
Where are you, Senator Paul, on immigration?
I think the first thing you do is you have to have border security, and you have to enforce the law. We have not had a president, Republican or Democrat, in my lifetime who's enforced the law, and this goes all the way back to Reagan, really. And we haven't had a president who will say the law is the law. It's illegal to come across illegally, but we don't do anything about it. So I think you have to, the first thing you have to do is have a zero tolerance for anybody new coming across the border. Now, I have said if you'll do that there probably can be some accommodation for people who are not criminals, who want to be workers to get work visas. And actually, Ted Cruz used to agree with me on it now, but I think he's starting to demagogue the whole issue of amnesty and saying he was never for this and never for that. And in actuality, during the debate, he was much closer to my position, is that we would figure out, once we had border security, what to do with those who were in our country. Now he's sort of put them on a bus and he's going to send them home kind of thing. But I don't think that's realistic. I think it is realistic to secure the border moving forward. I don't think it's realistic to put 11 million people in camps or buses and try to send them home. And I think that's Ted's position now, but his position used to be, when we had this debate a couple years ago, closer to my position.
Where are you on E-Verify and interior enforcement? As we know, a lot of people come to the country illegally on a plane or at a port of entry. They get a visa and they overstay. Hundreds of thousands, in fact, 500,000 last year alone. What do you think about interior enforcement and E-Verify?
I've never been as excited about E-Verify because it worries me that we would be showing a national ID every time. Everybody would have to, because you couldn't just say, oh, only immigrants are going to show it. Everybody would kind of have to show a national ID. I think there's another way, though, that kind of gets to it, and that would be that within your tax records, if you don't have proof that your people are citizens, if you're audited, you would lose your ability to deduct their wages. And that would ruin most businesses. So if I have 100 workers and they're here illegally and I'm no longer allowed to deduct their wages against my profit, I think that would ruin a lot of people. And so then maybe the built-in incentive, the threat of being audited, the threat of not having legal workers, losing that exemption might be a way to do it. But there are various ways to do it. But the bottom line is you have to have enforcement, and that is at the border, and there probably has to be enforcement some within the business world as well.
If you were in fact the GOP candidate, how do you think you would match up favorably against Hillary Clinton? On what issues do you think you'd be able to bring that slice of the American electorate that's necessary for you to actually win the White House over to your side?
I think I'm the only Republican candidate who's actually traveled to the south side of Chicago, been to Philadelphia, been to Ferguson, been to Baltimore, and talked about how criminal justice has unfairly, not purposely, but unfairly incarcerated a whole generation of young African American men. If you go to Ferguson, for every 100 women, African American women, there's only 60 African American men because they've been locked up. And oftentimes for crimes that white kids are committing also, but they just aren't getting caught because of the circumstances of white kids living in more affluent areas where there's less crime and less patrols. And so I'm the one candidate that's actually showing up, saying I support school choice, talking about economic freedom zones that Jack Kemp used to talk about expanding a base of lower taxes in areas of poverty. So I'd compete for the African American vote. I'm the only candidate that has already shown that I will do that. But I'm a candidate that will reach out across party lines to do it. I'm also not afraid to go after Hillary Clinton, either on Benghazi. I think what she did was a disgrace, not the spin, not the movie, but the disgrace was 6 months in advance denying them the security they requested. I also am not afraid to call her a hypocrite for saying that she's a champion of women's rights when taking money from countries that have historic abuses of women's rights. They whip people publicly who have been raped. in Saudi Arabia, and she took $10 million from them. They stoned women to death for alleged adultery in Brunei. She took $1 million from the Sultan of Brunei. So all of these things will add up. I think it'll be very difficult for her to be a women's champion if we have a solid candidate that's not afraid of the Clintons.
All right, Senator Paul, thank you very much for joining. We appreciate it.
Thank you.